everyone, welcome back to my channel. This is Heidi from My Reading Life, and I'm here to film my rankings and reviews for the nonfiction quarterfinals round, which just ended on Thursday, or was just announced on Thursday, the winners of that round. So I will link the Booktube prize video down below where Robert announces which books made it through to the semifinals round. Very interesting results, I will say. But first, let me get into my rankings and reviews. So I was reading for the quarterfinals nonfiction group B, which had had a couple of memoirs, one very long history book, and some other sort of social justice type books, and a science book. So it was a real interesting mix of books. So let me just get into how I ranked these books and what I thought of them. So in sixth place, I'm going to go from my number 6 book, which was my least favorite, to my number 1, which was my most favorite. So number 6 was I'm Glad My Mom Died by Jeanette McCurdy, which is a memoir. I listened to this on audiobook, and it's read by the author herself. So Jeanette McCurdy was a child actress. She starred on the Nickelodeon TV show iCarly, and then had a spinoff into her own show from that. My daughter was a big fan of iCarly, so that show was on quite a lot in this household during her growing up years, but I never really watched it. I was aware of it, but I wasn't like fully involved in it. So this memoir, and I will say all of these books in total for the group that I read were good books. There were no bad books in this bunch. It's just a matter of how much I personally liked each of them. So while I actually liked listening to this book, this memoir, it just, for me, this was my issue with it. So this is a memoir of her time growing up from early childhood up until her 20s, in which she is very much abused by her mother. Like, I'm just going to put it out there. She's very much abused by her mother. Her mother sort of has this idea that she wanted to be an actress, and so she's going to make sure one of her children becomes an actor. And so she manipulates her daughter into becoming an actress. And McCurdy never really enjoyed being an actress. She just did it to please her mother. And so she, at the age of like 5 and 6, started acting in commercials and as bit parts in TV shows, and then catches her big break when she gets hired to play one of the lead roles in iCarly. And so this book, she's just very methodically telling the story of her life, what it was like, how much she loved her mother and how much she wanted to please her mother, and how her mother manipulated her to do stuff. But the problem was with the book that I found, and I will say another thing, content warnings throughout for disordered eating, for child abuse, for, like all sorts of things, like all the content warnings for this book. But the way that the story is told is very emotionally disconnected from the subject matter. And for me, that just didn't work in a memoir format. I just felt like she was just reciting what happened without a lot of context around how she felt about it, or what, she would tell you, these things happened and I was not happy. But that was very basic. There wasn't a lot of context or thought or emotion around any of that. And so it just felt very disconnected for me. So while I was, the book was easy to listen to, it, was a fast read, I just felt like it just didn't connect with me in the way that I want a memoir to connect with. So that one was in 6th place. And then in fifth place, I had Blood and Ruins, The Last Imperial War, 1931 to 1945 by Richard Overy. Now, this is a 1,000-page history of World War II, and it is a comprehensive history of World War II. It is extremely detailed. It is fully encompassing. This would be a perfect book to read in a college-level history class. It could be the textbook for that. I mean, it's written more engagingly than a textbook, but it has all the details you would ever want to teach about World War II, I think. And it's just too much. I read the physical copy of this in hardcover, and the text is so dense on the page. There's very little white space. The chapters are super long. Most of the chapters were at least 100 pages long. And there's no pictures. There's just text. There's just text from margin to margin, from top to bottom. And you just feel like you're reading and reading and reading and reading and reading, and you're never getting a break. So while it is incredibly informative to read this book, I learned a lot from it. I think it's just too broad in scope. It needed to have more focus. He ostensibly is talking about how imperialism drove World War II, the imperial situations that all the Western powers were in, and then the fact that the Axis powers wanted to be imperial. They wanted to have colonies and territories, and felt that was the way that they could achieve greatness or money or, the resources that their countries needed, which is a great lens to look at World War II through. But it was just like, these many tanks were employed in this particular battle, and these many troops, and these many guns, and these many horses. And I was like, I don't care how many tanks were used in any particular individual battle during World War II. So the second half of the book was more interesting to me because that was more about the social impact, the human impact. I mean, not the human impact, the social impact of the war on each of these countries, what it did to their populations, how the impacts of the war were on economies and cultures. And that was really the most interesting part of this to me. The stuff about, how Jewish people were impacted, how, the residents of colonized countries were forced to fight for the countries that had colonized them in World War II. All that stuff was really interesting. But in the end, I think, again, it's just too broad in scope. It's just too much in one book. So that one was number 5. Number 4 is going to be a surprise to people, I know, considering the books in my group. But number 4 for me was The Song of the Cell, An Exploration of Medicine and the New Human by Siddhartha Mukherjee. This is the second book that I've read by Mukherjee. I read his book, The Emperor of All Maladies, many years ago. That's his biography of cancer. Excellent, excellent book. I was very much looking forward to reading The Song of the Cell. And in fact, I had started the book previous to this round of the Booktube Prize. I own it as an ebook. And I was reading it on my Kindle before I was even announced that I had this particular group. But for me, what is this book about? It's the history of the cell and cell biology, how we figured out that organisms are made up of multiple cells, that we're multicellular animals, and how we figured out everything about the interior of a cell, how cells work, how cells are the powerhouses of organisms, all of that stuff. So it's the history of cell biology and how cells are structured. And then there's descriptions of how cells work within the body, how different organs are structured and what those organs do within your body, and how body systems work and how cells play a role in that and how central they are to basically everybody or every living thing in the world, how central cells are to that construction. And there are several case studies, medical case studies within the book that illustrate certain points that he's trying to make. And it's very, very informative. And Mukherjee can certainly write. He's a very talented author. But for me, some parts of the book just dragged. I have never been a fan of cell biology and sort of that basic biological structure. That's never been my favorite part of biology. I'm more into ecology than I am biology in the most basic sense of building blocks of life. And I just would get lost at times. And I just felt the book dragged. And I would have wanted to see more personal stories, more of Mukherjee's stories of his own medical practice and things that he's learned in his life over the years. Those parts were really engaging and really, I felt very involved in the book. But I think overall, he's not as an engaging of a writer to me as somebody like Ed Yong or David Quammen. I feel he gets a little too lost in the weeds about the details of some of these things. And I'm most interested in sort of the new science and technologies and medical breakthroughs and things like that, the personal stories of how this impacts people, I think, are things that I'm more interested in. And there was less of that in this book than I had wanted. So again, a really good book. I mean, this is not a bad book by any means, but in terms of the overall group, it was in number 4 for me. So then number 3, I'm sorry, I'm just flipping through my notes here so I don't forget any details. So number 3 for me. So these next 3 books are the books that I voted to make it through to the next round of the prize. Number 3 was Did Ye Hear Mammy Died by Seamus O'Reilly, which again I listened to on audiobook and was read by the author, and so charming. Like, he does such a good job of narrating his own book. So Seamus O'Reilly was born one of 11 children to a Catholic family in Ireland in like sort of the end of the Troubles era. And his mom died when he was 5 years old. So this is his memoir of his childhood and of being a child who grows up without one parent, and what that impact did to his family of 11 children and his dad raising this family by himself from the time that Seamus is 5 years old. It is so heartwarming and humorous. He writes it with a lot of humor. He tells funny stories. It's a love letter to his dad, who was a wonderful, wonderful parent, and really just his family in general was so close and so interesting. And like, there was such a huge age gap between like the oldest siblings in the family and the youngest siblings in the family. It was almost like they were separate groups of kids in this family, and it was really interesting to see how they all interacted with each other. There's some fun he grows up in the 80s and 90s, and so there's some fun pop culture references that really related to me, because that's, you know, I was a teenager in the 80s, and it's very interesting culturally to read about what it was like to be a Catholic family in Ireland at this time period, the different cultural aspects to how families operated in this time period. There is a little bit about the Troubles and how that impacted his family, but it's not really about that. It's about a family, and how a family, how this one family weathered the storm of losing their beloved mother, who was just a wonderful woman by all accounts, and how they managed to make it work together as a family. Like I said, it was just told with humor and heart. He narrates it wonderfully. I would highly recommend this book on audio if you want to read it. It is labeled as a grief memoir, but I did not find it to be overly burdensome in that way. It was not moored in the grief part of it, because he was so young when his mother died. He's been dealing with the grief of losing his mother, but in a different way than you would deal with that as a person who was grown up and had been, had a mother in your life, till you were 18, 19, 20, that sort of grief that you would deal with at losing your parent. When you're 5, you don't have that same mental capacity to deal with the grief. So he's had to deal with it in a different way than some of his older siblings have. And I love that discussion as well. I thought that was really interesting, and just a lovely, lovely story. So that was number 3 for me. And then these next 2 books are both highly, highly recommended for me. So number 2 for me was the book Half American by Matthew Delmont. And this is the history of racism as experienced by Black Americans serving in World War II. So another World War II book, but this one's a history specifically of what it was like to be Black American at this time period, wanting to serve your country, in fact, agreeing to serve your country to fight in World War II, and then experiencing, just virulent racism as you try to do that. So there's a lot of heroism and patriotism that is described in this book that I was unaware of, that has been left out of the history books, has been in some cases actively suppressed in being left out of history of the United States, and how we operated during World War II. And so that was, I learned a lot, just specific facts and events and things that I didn't know anything about. So I learned a lot from this book. And then also talks about how there's this myth that World War II was like the good war, right? And it was fought by the greatest generation, and all of this stuff that we're sort of steeped in as Americans. That's how World War II is described to us. But yet there was this whole section of our population who was actively either left out of that or held back from that, or in the case of Japanese Americans, stuffed into concentration camps, internment camps, and not allowed to participate at all. So this book really examines that piece of American history and describes how wrong that is, that was all left out, and that we really need to understand that all of these things happened and we need to come to grips with it. So I love that. This book, though, I will tell you, and the reason why it's in number 2 and not in number 1 is because I physically reacted to reading this book. Like, it made me so angry and so upset that I physically felt ill reading this book, and I would have to take breaks and put it down and walk away from it because I would be so upset by the things that I was reading. Like, I still just thinking about it right now, it makes me so upset to read about. So I will just warn you to be aware of that when you go in. I think it's very important, and I think you should all read it. And it's written extremely well in terms of it reads really easily. But it is really, really tough to read emotionally. And I would also say that it's so frustrating to read about something that's so stupid that you would hold back a whole section of your population from participating in something and just lose all of their skill sets and their abilities and their talents to achieving whatever objective it is that you want to achieve. You know, I felt the same way when I read Hidden Figures about the women who, the Black women who helped with NASA and helped get us into space. Like, you're just cutting off your own nose to spite your face when you do stuff like that, when you deny people the ability to participate in any action just because you don't like their skin color, or you don't like their gender, or you don't like their sexuality, or whatever it is that you don't like about them. Like, you're just hurting yourself because you're losing all of those talents and those abilities that could be brought to bear on the problem you're trying to solve. So frustrating, but so important, and so many stories that need to be told, and so much information that needs to be out there in the public and needs to just be known, like the way we know, you know, that George Washington was the general during the Revolutionary War. Like, we need to know about these Black World War II pilots who were so successful in their missions in World War II in Europe, and other things like the Black women that, you know, went to work to help produce all of the war material that we needed to fight World War II, or became nurses, or whatever. Like, there's all of these things that Black Americans did during World War II, and we just don't know because they've been left out of the stories we've been told, and that's just wrong. And then number 1, my favorite book out of this bunch, and an absolute 5-star read for me. And I read it from the library, and so I'm going to definitely be purchasing a copy to have in my own personal library. And it's Under the Skin: The Hidden Toll of Racism on American Lives and on the Health of Our Nation by Linda Villarosa. And this book, again, another book that should be required reading for all Americans. And it talks about how the daily impact of experiencing racism and prejudice takes a toll on your health, your physical health, and how, like, the research and the information we know about how health works and how our bodies work shows that constantly being under stress of dealing with racism can actually cause poor health outcomes, physical health outcomes, from like heart disease and diabetes, and many of the very normal medical conditions that people deal with every day are made worse, and in some cases made a lot worse, by the toll that racism takes on those people. So this isn't just a book about how certain groups of people are marginalized because they've been sort of stuffed into geographical locations that aren't served by medical facilities. That's part of it. But it's more about how even people who are, you know, born into wealthy families and who have access to all the public health and all the medical care that you could ever want still experience worse health outcomes, medical health outcomes, because of the toll that the stress of this racism has taken on their body. And there's quite a bit in here about Black women and their the fact that they experience higher rates of infant mortality and complications in pregnancy and in giving birth. And there's some very famous examples like Serena Williams and some other like people who have all the access that they could ever want to medical care, but still experience worse outcomes than white Americans. And this book very specifically details the facts around this. So this is not just opinion, this is not conjecture, this is the facts. This is where research has shown these things are occurring. And in fact, the author, Villarosa, makes comparisons between the health outcomes for Black Americans and the health outcomes for poor, rural, white Americans. There's a lot of overlap with what's happening with health outcomes in terms of life expectancy, infant mortality, things, the standards that we track for how we rank countries on how well that they're doing sort of overall. These groups of people within the United States are doing worse than others. And this book very clearly outlines why that is. This book is incredible. It is so well written, is so well researched, it's very tightly constructed. It's only like 250 pages, so she takes a lot of information, synthesizes it, and puts it out there in a very clear and concise way. It's very, very well done. So this is my best book of this group. I am super pleased that it did make it through to the next round. So it is in the top 12. It is in the semifinal round for the Booktube prize. Both this book and Half American made it through, which is fantastic. I think both of these books are very worthy of going the whole way and winning the prize. Should that happen, I would be extremely pleased. So Did Ye Hear Mammy Die dropped out, which is sad, but I am not, even though I didn't put it in third place, I'm not sad that Song of the Cell made it through in my group, because I do think it is a great book. Just think for me personally, it did not give me the enjoyment and the satisfaction of reading it that Did You Hear Mammy Die did. So, I am pleased with the outcome for my group for what made it through. And I'm sure all future Booktube Prize judges in the semifinals and the finals are glad that Blood and Ruins dropped out. So, yeah, it was awesome. It was such a great group to read. And I will be reading, of course, for the semifinal round. I am Nonfiction Group B again. So I have 4 books that I have not yet read in my group. I have the 2 books that I have already read are Under the Skin, so you already know how I feel about that one, and An Immense World by Ed Yong, which I actually read before the Booktube Prize started this year. So I have 4 new books to read this round, and when the end of the round happens in the beginning of August, I will come back and let you know what I thought about those books. So hope you're all doing well and finding some great books to read. I will talk to you later.